Good morning. It's my pleasure to introduce Yara to the almond stage today. For over 100 years, Yara's crop nutrition solutions have been helping farmers achieve high yields and produce healthy crops. This morning, we will hear from Devin Clark, Yara's permanent crop manager. Devin also oversees their research-focused incubator farm, where they trial a number of different management practices and nutrition solutions to bring you the best products, which I think is really cool. Please help me welcome to the podium, Devin Clark.
Oh, that's a hell of a fan club. I appreciate it. Appreciate it. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for being here today. So I wanted to talk in a very practical sense about establishing a value proposition for soil health. Just to set the stage a little bit, I come from an advisory role. I was a crop advisor in the field for 5.5 years before I took this role, work with growers on a day-to-day basis and understand the challenges that they're facing and how this nebulous idea of soil health needs to be brought down to a very practical focus for growers to be able to make improvements in that area. So first I want to look at the topic of what is a healthy soil. So as we look at these three images here, we can see three very different soil types in different conditions. All of these are essentially in a natural state. So I'd like you to tell me, out of A, B, or C here, which one would you consider to be a healthy soil? Okay, I'm going to give you the political answer here, and that is, it depends. It depends, right? So the really important part that we have to focus on is that perspective is everything, right? And so are we talking about a natural versus a working land? Are we talking about annual or perennial cropping systems? Are we looking at this from the perspective of the grower or a consumer, right? And a really important one that really is prominent in the discussion around soil health, is this a Midwest soil condition or is this a California Central Valley condition? So then I wanted to discuss a little bit about some of the opportunities that do exist within almond production systems. So first off, we need to look at some of the key attributes of soil health in general. Now, these are physical, chemical, and biological functions within the soil, and they're really critical to any discussion that we have on soil health. And the nice thing is that this general framework is adaptable to any cropping system, any soil type, any location, and there are direct and indirect interactions that we have to be aware of when we're looking at trying to make improvements in this area on our farming production systems. So some of the positive aspects that we have going for us in almond production is looking at the infrastructure, for starters, that we have to be able to deliver some of our key inputs, being water and crop nutrition and even soil amendments in some cases, right? So we have this, we have over 70% of the almond industry is on either micro or drip sprinkler irrigation. So we have the ability to apply these inputs directly to the root zone where we're going to be able to see the greatest amount of uptake and the greatest amount of influence on that rhizosphere system, okay? The next one I would mention is orchard lifespan. So when you hear the discussions about soil health when it's coming from the Midwest, one of the big ones is no-till, right? We have this established system that's going to be in the ground for 25 years, usually at the least, which is a no-till system by design. So we have that going for us. We have root architecture and biomass production. So when you look at this root zone that we have here in the upper image, you can see all of those those primary and secondary and tertiary root systems that are really designed to feed the microbes in the soil. So all the carbohydrates that are produced in the canopy are being translocated down when they're not in demand from the nuts themselves and feeding the soil microbiome system. And so with the densities that we have and with the architecture that we have of these root systems, we have a great ability to reciprocate food back to that microbial system. And then the last one is biomass recycling. And so here we can see on the bottom left an image of an orchard that's been pushed out. Now, if we're talking about whole orchard recycling, or even talking on an annual basis where we have prunings and leaf matter and things like that that are being usually chipped up and recycled back into the orchard floor, that's a natural part of our management systems today. And so that gives us the ability to, again, bring carbon back into that system and feed that microbial basis. Some of the key challenges that we're facing in almond production, there's many, but I'm going to focus on just a few here. Looking at water quality and availability. So microbes we need to have moisture within that soil to be able to support that microbe system, and we need to have a good chemical balance. Some of our harvest management practices, okay? We have to keep those center rows clean, and we have to be able to have those center rows able to not suck up all the almonds and get trapped within there as we come through with our pickup machines. So we need to maintain the vegetation control as we go to harvest. And then after harvest, a lot of times we're scraping that stuff back out, trying to flatten those rows back out to prepare for the next harvest. And so this creates a challenge. Resource competition, right? So we want to have an orchard system that is able to be efficient. That means we're trying to have essentially a closed loop of inputs relative to outputs. And so if you do have external competing species, whether it be weeds or insects or what have you, we have resource competition that becomes a problem. Compaction, with all of the numbers of trips that we take through the orchard for various purposes, depending on the time of season also, if you have a wetter soil condition and you're having to go through and do bloom sprays, you're creating compaction in that process. And the last one that I want to mention is the assessment part of it. So because we have these permanent crop structures that exist in this production system, we don't have the flexibility of doing whole plant dissections and removing those whole plants to be able to understand the nutrients and everything that is required year over year. That work has been funded by Almond Board in the past and has created a great basis for us, but it creates limitations in how we can assess some of these improvements that we make over time with that permanent system. So then I wanted to talk a little bit about changing our perspective. So when we look at some of the varied definitions that exist for soil health, and this has been from multiple reports, and we have the references listed there as well, you can see that none of them are the same, right? So there is essentially no definitive definition for soil health at this point in time, and that in and of itself is a challenge. One thing that we do see populating in just about all of these is the fact that we kind of have to take an ecosystem perspective and look at our cropping systems in that way if we want to go down this path of improving soil health. So when we look at this ecosystem, this is a very pretty picture here, right? And not necessarily what we're going to be seeing in the field all the time. But we're looking at the rhizosphere, and we're looking at all of these different players, starting with the highest trophic level being, or the first trophic level being the plant species, and then all of these other macro and micro organisms that exist naturally within any soil system. Some of them are beneficial, and some of them can help us control certain issues. Some of them are negative and help and create challenges for us as far as producing quality year in, year out. And so what we've done over the last many of centuries is you can see the image of the evolution of maize or corn in this upper left. So the wild ancestor there on the far left has now been purposefully manipulated by agricultural innovators, we'll say, over the last number of centuries into what we recognize today as our standard hybrid corns, right? So we've been doing everything in our power to control all the variables that exist within our agricultural operations so that we can maximize our output. And that's really important. We've done a phenomenal job and been able to support a lot more innovation in the process because of how much food we are able to produce in such an efficient way. But we also have to be cognizant of the different species that Mother Nature provides to us that help provide some control of elements that are really problematic for us. And this one, I'm looking at navel orangeworm specifically. So on that upper right, you have a parasitoid. And you can see how that parasitoid lays these eggs inside the navel orangeworm larvae. And all those eggs basically just consume that navel orangeworm from the inside out. Okay. On the bottom left, we have a fungal pathogen. This is Bovaria bassiana. This is a fungal pathogen of navel orangeworm and other lepidopteran pests, and it actually grows from the inside out within the species, and it will kill them from the inside out again. We have BT in the bottom center there, and then recent publications that are looking at the ability of cover crops to be able to really facilitate the decomposition of mummy nuts within the orchard and reduce that food stock that navel orangeworm has to be able to sustain from one generation in the dormant season into that first flight in the spring. So we really need to go from kind of like a 2D dimension to a 3D dimension, right? We need to be starting to think about what is the outcome that we want to strive for within the next 1 year, within the next 5 years, within the next 10 years? What is the outcome that you're looking for? And then what are the functions that are going to support that outcome from the soil standpoint? What are the additional support mechanisms and organisms that are going to drive those functions that we're trying to use to drive that outcome? And what are the antagonistic mechanism, organisms, elements that are in our farming system that prevent us from doing that? And then also looking at the impact from the perspective of the other management practices that are required. So if there's no greater takeaway from this talk, I really want to enforce that starting with a very tangible and quantifiable goal from a grower standpoint, from an advisor standpoint, is a great place to start if you want to make strides down this road of improving soil health. So we start with an outcome-based approach, and let's take an example of having a lack of water availability for a particular grower. The water costs are maybe $1,000 an acre foot, and that's probably a median cost, I guess, at this point in time. Say it's a grower that's 40 acres and they have a water bill that's $160,000 a year for that 40 acres. Okay, they want to save or increase the revenue by 10% without compromising yield, and that's a really key factor because we hear a lot about absolute cuts. We need to be focused on the efficiency of what we're using from an input standpoint relative to units of food production. Okay, so if we want to do that 10% savings, then that means we need to either decrease our costs of our water inputs by $400 an acre, or we need to improve the utility of about 4.8 inches of water. And so from there, now you need to recognize what are the functions within that soil system that are going to drive that improvement that you're looking for. So soil water holding capacity, root access to that moisture, water use efficiency. And then from that step, you go down one more granular level and you look at what are the attributes of the soil that are going to support those functions. So we have soil organic matter, soil structure, looking at how we're managing our irrigation scheduling, what is our infiltration rate in our soil, and also crop nutrition management can play a significant role in the ultimate utilization of that water to produce nuts. And then lastly, we want to look at, again, those antagonistic elements that are preventing us from making those strides that we're trying to achieve. And then we need to think about evaluation, right? So the old adage, you can't manage what you can't measure. And this is where taking this really nebulous idea of soil health gets really granular, and we have to have something that we can actively measure, actively quantify, and then look at that relative to what our budget is and understand what we've made in improvements on our net productivity and our net profitability. So with Yara, we launched a Better Soil Alliance last year. We've completed our first full year of trial work. And so this is basically a partnership and in a group of like-minded organizations that are striving to activate this collaborative community in the almond market to drive practical solutions that impact food production by improving water use efficiency, soil health, and also lowering greenhouse gas emissions in the process. So we have partnerships established. We have a digitally enabled platform to be able to ingest data and be able to look at that in a meaningful way and translate that into actionable processes for the growers. We also have funding incentives that are built into this. So this evaluation process is really driving accelerated learnings in this space. We have 3 different tiers of evaluation structure, using one, our incubator farm at a very detailed level, using a lot of on-site measurements to evaluate what are those improvements that we're actually seeing in those tangible soil health metrics. And then we have all the way to a crowdsourced farm, which is a little bit of a lighter touch and not a lot of on-site measurements, but getting yield information back, water use information back, nitrogen use information back. And then in between that, we have our case study farms where we're doing some more on-site work with some of our tech partners that we have here. And the whole goal of this is being able to reach not only the granular level of information that we need to understand how accurate these improvements are and how repeatable they are, but also be able to address this at scale and cross all different soil types and all different regions within the almond industry in California. And then we also, in this process, are creating this community to be able to facilitate discussion among members, facilitate discussion among industry stakeholders, so that we can all work on these types of issues together in a meaningful way. So I mentioned that because in that process, these are some of the measurements that we are taking at all of the case study farm sites and the incubator farm sites to get that actual change at the soil level. So we're looking at aggregate stability, we're looking at water holding capacity, soil nutrients and chemical interactions, looking at organic matter, active carbon, PLFA, which is really a microbial kind of DNA analysis in a lot of ways, and also looking at yield as a primary driver. So using our incubator farm example, we've got 3 years of data collection efforts here. Only in the last year did we implement the Better Soil Alliance protocol. But in this, we look at the baseline versus the My Almonds program, so the yellow versus the white. The water treatments have been exactly the same across all 4 of these. The only difference is the nutrition inputs and the way that we are managing those nutrition inputs. And the My Almonds is a high frequency, low volume strategy and driving our inputs based on crop demand and uptake. And so what we can see from this is that over the last number of years, over 3 years on average, we've improved our water use efficiency by 14%. Now, what that translates to in a practical sense is 7 inches of water per year is going to more productivity, and that $500 an acre, using the previous example, and it's going to pop up here that we looked at previously. Using that example, that's $580 an acre per year. So we are meeting that goal that that grower had set or that advisor had set. And on top of that, we are not immune to the fact that we have to be focused on ROI from a profitability standpoint. We've been able to produce on average $1,200 an acre net ROI improvement through that process. So this last year, again, we layered in that Better Soil Alliance protocol. We were able to see some moderate improvements in trends against the baseline program or the grower standard program in the areas of active carbon, total microbial biomass, and organic matter. Now we're looking at multiple sites and multiple years to be able to really validate these results, and that structure that we have set in place is going to help us do that. But most management practices that support soil and ecosystem health really have a reciprocal trade-off relationship, and we have to look at those as well. So now we're going to go into quantifying the value and looking at some of those trade-offs and some of those adaptations that you would have to make from a very practical standpoint when improving certain aspects of soil health. So in this case, let's look at increased organic matter. We hear a lot about that. What happens when you have increased organic matter? If you are relying on that from a nitrogen standpoint, your predictable supply of nitrogen becomes a little bit more ambiguous, right? That nitrogen supply from an organic matter standpoint is reliant on microbial processes. We have a great deal of demand that occurs early in the season when we have cooler soils. And so that microbial activity is based on temperature in that soil. And as that warms up, the microbial activity warms up. So if we're relying on organic matter for nitrogen, what are we doing early in the season to be able to support that mineralization, right? Increased soil carbon. There's a lot of studies out there that show that with increased carbon in the soil, think about any advisor that's made a faulty herbicide application. How do we correct that? We apply activated carbon to try and tie up that active ingredient. So we have herbicide tie-up that occurs when we have increased soil carbon. If we improve water holding capacity, we have to rethink how we're scheduling our irrigation sets now, because we may not need as much as we think we do relative to that holding capacity. And if you're still applying that same schedule to it, you may be oversupplying water and potentially creating issues like phytophthora in the process. And then lastly, living roots in an ecosystem are really important. If we increase the ground cover, then we have to think about all the issues associated with increased labor and mowing to be able to keep that ground cover in a maintained and managed form. So this is the only Midwest reference that I have in here, and I apologize for having to do that. But the gal this morning from UCA A&R that was doing the cost studies, she talked about a partial budget analysis. And so this is just a snapshot of a partial budget analysis for somebody that was doing a regenerative ag type of practice in corn and soybeans. But it's important that you go back and you look through those inputs, the cost of those inputs, and you really quantify the value of that water from that very tangible example, that savings or that yield improvement that you were able to make, and make sure that this is going to maintain profitability for you long term. And so whatever your inputs are, capture them, take them down, look at the increased cost, look at the savings, and create that partial budget analysis to know how positive that response was from a profitability standpoint. So in conclusion, there is really no definition and no formula for soil health. There are regional and temporal and site-specific conditions and context that is required to start this journey, and we can't just use a one-size-fits-all approach. There are unique opportunities that exist within almond production systems, and there are numerous indicators, but they must be tied to very specific objectives to be able to actually quantify that value. So if we want to go down that road, begin with a very practical and a measurable goal that's going to increase your long-term viability as a producer. Start with an outcome-based focus. Look at the soil functions that support that. Look at the deeper level of soil elements that are going to support those functions, and then be cognizant of those antagonistic elements as well. And then we also have to be aware of those trade-offs and those adaptations that have to be made, because when I say we take a look at this from an ecosystem perspective, nothing occurs in a silo. Any management change is going to have an impact somewhere else in that ecosystem, and we have to be aware of where those trade-offs and adaptations have to occur. You have to understand from your perspective as a grower, what are the non-starters and what elements just require a little bit more thought to overcome, and maybe an additional tweak in a different area to be able to implement that strategy. And you always have to come back to provide that partial budget analysis or some type of economic analysis to understand where you end long-term from a profitability standpoint. I have can't see the contact information down here below, but you can also find me at our Yara booth if you have any other questions, or I think we're down to the end of the timer. Okay, wonderful. Thank you all. Appreciate it.
Just a quick reminder that the FFA silent auction is ending soon, I think about 30 minutes. And if you hang around here, next up we are going to be hearing from some of the special projects from the Almond Leadership Program. So that'll be starting in 10 minutes.